Segal, good morning. Skanakoa, do you know the Great Peace that we started talking about, virtually as soon as we arrived here? I begin by sending greetings to the Coast Salish people on whose traditional territory we're meeting today. We thank you for your hospitality to us and your faithfulness in caring for the lands and waters in this place from time immemorial even to the present. I also thank Willie for his work over the past years and his sparkling new ideas that he's presenting here, inviting us to reflect on the concept of ethical space, and for his persistent challenge for those of us who take up the idea of ethical space to do something with it. And it reminds me of the challenge of Chief Jacob Thomas, now deceased and a mentor of mine, who, following a teaching on the great law of peace, which is the foundational ethic of a multi-nation confederation of the Iroquois. And his affirmation is that peace is supposed to work. It doesn't come to rest as an intellectual construct. It pervades everyday reality. And the theme of what I have to say this morning is that ethical space is not new or empty. It has been created in encounters between peoples coming from different directions and different experiences throughout history. Ethical space is populated with people of good mind coming together to make good relations. And I thank Willie for popularizing something that he acknowledges is not new, but was spoken, written by someone before him that he borrows. Making good relations was a theme repeated in early exchanges between First Nations and settlers. It was represented in the two-row wampum belt, woven as a record of a treaty in 1615 between the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois peoples, and Dutch colonists. The belt consists of two rows of purple wampum beads on a white background, and this is a replica made by some students in a culture class, and it goes back to it goes back 400 years. The symbols: 3 rows of white beads symbolizing peace, friendship, and respect lie between the 2 purple rows. The 2 purple rows symbolize the wake of 2 vessels, a Haudenosaunee canoe and a Dutch sailing ship, traveling in parallel down the river of life. 1 row symbolizes the Haudenosaunee, that is Iroquois people, with their laws and customs, while the other row symbolizes European laws and customs. As nations move together side by side on the river of life, they remain close enough to render assistance in times of need, but they are to avoid steering each other's vessels or otherwise interfering with one another. For good reason, the measured distance between the European sailing ship and the Haudenosaunee canoe has been emphasized in references to the Treaty of 1615, which was renewed from the Dutch to the English, to being embodied in relations with the colony of Canada. So there's a good reason for saying there's a measured distance, non-interference. But I have been deeply moved by the symbolism of the 3 beads that link our peoples together. We don't veer off in different directions. We are ethically bound together by the shared commitment to peace, friendship, and respect. One of the things I've discovered in studying history and intercultural relations is that the same words can be used with vastly different meanings by two persons or two nations having a conversation. So I want to say more about the meaning of those three beads that have been handed down and elaborated in Iroquois and oral tradition. Peace, spoken of often in this gathering, is symbolized by the first bead and is not just laying down arms by peoples in conflict. Peace is a sacred gift brought by a messenger of the Creator to save the 5 nations from themselves, save them from destroying each other and themselves. Peace means casting off all weapons into the deep underneath waters where they are carried away to be seen no more. And planted in the chasm created there is the tree of peace. As the fundamental value of the Iroquois Confederacy, peace means that once united, once brought together in peace, former enemies defend one another, look out for each other's well-being. Peace then allows individual members to live in safety and to exercise their spirits, their gifts. For those who would say, but the Mohawks still made war, that's true. But the hope for sacred peace is always there. It's battered and it suffers disappointment, but it continues in the language Skanagoa, the greeting that says we are related, we have common values. And it's that culture and language that Mohawks and others of the 6 nations are revitalizing. The second white bead symbolizes friendship. My granddaughters used to sign their text messages with BFF, best friends forever. But disagreements come, families move, they outgrow old friendships. A traditional teacher of mine said that persons knowledgeable in medicines who counseled each other sometimes advised that the person seeking healing needed a friend. He didn't need medications, or he didn't need the manipulation. He needed a friend, or she needed a friend. And the medicine person might go so far as to describe in detail the kind of friend who would bring healing. A friendship that heals links people together to celebrate accomplishments and mourn losses. A friend lifts you up when you're down, reminds you to look out for the cliff you're in danger of falling over. And when the friendship becomes frayed, friends work together to forgive and repair their differences. The third white bead represents respect. A Cree elder described respect as looking twice, respect. He said, when we fall in love, we see in the other person just what we were looking for. He or she is a mirror reflection of our expectations. In time, if the relationship holds, we begin to see the other as a whole person, different from us, with all of her beauty and flaws. And that's when respect takes hold. Valuing a person or a people for who they are, not having to make them conform to our image of who they should be. Those 3 beads symbolize the relationship of peoples in the two-row mountain, each following their own course, but linked together by deeply embedded ethics. I have to stop here and share with you that I grew up having no awareness of the history or wisdom of the Iroquois people. I attended school on the Tyendinaga Reserve and nearby in the city of Belleville. And the only thing I recall hearing about our place in history was the murder of the Jesuits at Midland. When I was growing up at Tyendinaga, ceremonies were not performed openly. The Mohawk language was falling into disuse. Community affairs were managed by the Indian agent. Band council authority was limited to matters such as fence viewing and trespass of cattle. Ancient wampum belts were housed in museums with no orators to unlock the meanings contained in the beads. As an adult, I became a teacher and had the opportunity of listening to Iroquois elders and those of other nations. I discovered, to my amazement, that I had absorbed the lessons, life lessons in my family and community. And when I heard traditional teachings, I could often recognize them as things I already knew, but had no words for. It was like gaining a voice for a part of myself that had been mute. So you see, the absence of Indigenous knowledges in academia has not been only because the academic establishment excluded us. It has been also because most of us who made our way to the university had become disconnected from the sources and languages of traditional knowledge. The evolution of Indigenous studies that I've been a part of, virtually since its first emergence as a little particle, it has been a process of rediscovering voice for ourselves, as well as a voice in intercultural dialogue. What was unknown to the academic world for centuries was the depth of awareness of the complexities of the world at large and the inner reaches of the human spirit, conserved by Indigenous knowledge keepers, many of whom are passing on to the spirit world. Researchers at this conference have undoubtedly engaged in deconstruction of colonial history and the colonial mindset that denied the existence of Indigenous knowledges. If we made it into the university and gained membership in the research fraternity, then we have exposed ourselves to massive socialization into that oppressive worldview. In the early 1970s, when Native Studies was being introduced at Trent University, I attended a small dinner party and met Harold Cardinal, who had burst on the public scene not long before with his book, The Unjust Society. On hearing my enthusiastic commentary on what we were undertaking at Trent, Harold's response was, Native Studies is nothing more than white studies of Indians. And I was pretty disappointed with his harsh judgment, but of course he was right, for the most part. The writing on which we drew to introduce students just out of high school to an alternative view of Canada, past and present, was written by non-Indigenous anthropologists, sociologists, and occasionally historians, since Native history had not yet emerged as a subspecialty in the discipline. Our white studies of Indians were peppered with the distinctive views and experience of instructors teaching against the grain before that practice was recognized. Native Studies matured over the next 20 years, gaining a foothold in universities and colleges across Canada, and becoming clearer about our mission, making our institutions friendlier places for Indigenous students, and providing services to communities in the form of planning, policy, and community-driven research, which was usually uncompensated and unrecognized in the context of our day jobs. And I understand from conversations this is still the case very often. We listened to the advice from those communities about engaging with elders and focusing on languages which were endangered. We talked about distinct perspectives, but we were wary of claiming a point of view, or more expansively, a worldview, because legitimate research was supposed to be unbiased, looking to extend the boundaries of knowledge in the dispassionate pursuit of truth. I hesitate to claim that my experience with Indigenous studies represents the evolution of the discipline, but for me there were some seminal events that marked a sea change in the way we conceive of our work. The first of these was the insertion of Section 35 in the newly patriated Canadian Constitution in 1982, in which the key clause read, "The existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed." This meant that for the first time, the highest law in the land affirmed that First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples would be a continuing part of Canada. Even though the practical meaning of Aboriginal and treaty rights is still being defined in hard-won piecemeal Supreme Court decisions, extinguishment, wiping out of Aboriginal identities, languages, and attachment to our homelands will no longer be a legitimate state enterprise. Huge change. The second paradigm-shifting event for me was the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. Engaging the world community in acknowledging the fragility of Earth's ecosystem and affirming the value of Indigenous knowledges and practices in charting sustainable paths for all people for the future. A third seminal event of more modest scope was the creation of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, RCAP, in 1991. RCAP was given a wide-ranging mandate to examine what had gone wrong in the relationship between Aboriginal peoples and Canadian society, and to make recommendations that presumably would avert the kind of confrontation that had occurred at Oka, sending shock waves through the ranks of Canadian citizens. These events, constitutional protection that opened up new possibilities for defining our place in Canadian society, no longer murderers only. The recognition by the world community of the value of Indigenous knowledge, and a massive research undertaking involving Indigenous people in every walk of life had a cumulative effect. By the mid-1990s, scholars of Indigenous and settler origins were talking about Indigenous knowledges as systematic ways of interpreting reality and worldviews that are the heritage of all mankind, all humankind. The possibility and necessity of articulating ethical guidelines for research based on Indigenous values and practices became evident in the formation of the research program of the Royal Commission. Colleagues in Native Studies had been involved in the previous 20 years in development work, applying community-based research and participatory methods that were congenial to the task that we were engaged in. I think I saw research as an instrument for resistance to or reform of oppressive practices in public institutions, a means of mobilizing evidence that was true to the experience and aspirations of Aboriginal people. And it was based on our personal ethics of our responsibility to our relations. RCAP's first attempt at reaching out for community guidance on the program of research we were undertaking revealed how deep was the divide we were proposing to bridge. In 1992, RCAP convened a meeting at Nakota Lodge in Stoney Territory in Alberta, with some 75 Aboriginal people engaged in research, most at the community level and a few in universities. Our objective was to obtain assistance in designing the research program. David Hawks and I were co-directors of research, and as David attempted to begin the workshop, he was almost drowned out by loud complaints from the assembly about the evils of invasive research. "We have been researched to death," they cried. David turned to me to take over the chair, but I was not the one who brought order and focus to the exchange. The elder who had opened the gathering with prayer and ceremony spoke from the corner of the room in a gentle voice that nevertheless commanded the attention of everyone. "If it's true," he said, "that we have been researched to death, maybe it's time we started researching ourselves to life." There was silence for a moment, and then a visible shift in the mood of the crowd. I was not only vastly relieved that our workshop was not turning into a disaster, I was in awe at the depth of awareness of what I had just heard. The elder challenged the powerlessness being voiced by younger, more educated members of the meeting. "Is it true that we're dead?" He was open to the possibility that we might be in a unique time when the history of oppressive research could be changed. He recognized the power of research to enhance life, and he challenged the assembly to take charge of the tools and do something life-giving. And he included himself and the knowledge of his generation as part of the research enterprise. This elder was not intimidated by the mystique and the protocols of research, constraints that academics are so familiar with. He spoke out of a place of boldness and integrity, knowing what he knew and opening himself to the unknown unknowns, the things we don't know that we don't know, to paraphrase an American politician. That elder's words have been repeated often in the past 20 years. Researching ourselves to life has come to express the aspirations of a new generation of Aboriginal students and researchers. RCAP's ethical principles for research were developed by a subcommittee of Indigenous persons that incidentally included Harold Cardinal. What we tried to do from the outset in RCAP research was to marry the most meticulous, credible, documentary and academic research with Indigenous knowledge, voiced by participating First Nation, Inuit and Métis persons and collectives across the country. I believe that the experience of hundreds of Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers across Canada, brought together in principled, respectful collaboration with RCAP and with each other, had a huge impact on the confidence that First Nations, Inuit and Métis people now have that research can be an instrument for good in their lives. The ethical guidelines for research adopted by the Royal Commission were widely distributed and contributed to a dialogue on research that was already taking place. They were referenced in the first edition of the Tri-Council Policy Statement, Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Humans, in 1998. From 2003 to 2010, I had the enormous privilege of serving with a very accomplished group of researchers on the Interagency Advisory Panel on Research Ethics, PRE for short, to update the TCPS. I saw my role as facilitating the encounter between holders and practitioners of Indigenous knowledge and the academic research community to achieve a policy that would enable mutually beneficial collaboration between researchers and Aboriginal participants and their communities. The outcome was a dedicated chapter on research involving First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples situated in an integrated policy applicable to all research domains. The key provision mandates engagement between researchers and Aboriginal people who are involved, Aboriginal communities who are involved in the research. And as others before me have said, you can require people to come together, preferably in face-to-face, but you can't mandate ethical relations. You can't mandate the actions that go on there. So it was an article of faith that if the policy required people to come together, that in most cases, in many cases, good things would result. Sometimes they would go away and go away mad, but that's part of the risk that you take. And the judgment of Aboriginal advisors on the policy was, this is not perfect, but we can live with it. And with a promise that it would be further updated as it was tested out in practice. Searching for a title for my words today, I thought of calling it Creating Ethical Space 1615 to 2015, but that seems sort of presumptuous. Still, I'm struck by the contrast that the Haudenosaunee used 3 beads to signify the nature of the relationship between diverse peoples, while PRE required 40 pages to guide relations among among fairly narrow slices of our society. One interpretation of that difference in approach is that the Haudenosaunee anticipated that the human values of peace, friendship, and respect were embedded in the knowledge and experience of their people and could be called up. The meaning of those 3 beads could be called up to guide action in particular encounters. Did they trust back then that comparable values reached deep into the colonial society they were engaging with? In any case, the agreement foundered repeatedly in the turbulent waters of competing interests and power imbalances. Native studies or Indigenous studies has found a niche in universities across Canada, largely in response to the demand of students, both Aboriginal and settler origins, who want to peel back the claim that we have the best country in the world, who want to look behind the stereotypes that define us as the other, who want to find out the dynamics of making good relations. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the updating of the TCPS, now the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, can be construed as projects to expand ethical space among people who come from different directions with different experiences to find common ground, to make good relations? Is the cohort of people seeking peace expanding? Is the water supporting our vessels clear? Are the currents taking us in the direction that we want to go? Are there rocks and storms ahead to throw us off course or sink our boats? I expect that our conversations in these 2 days devoted to working better together will prove inspiring and sobering and energizing as we navigate the next bend in the river. Yeah.
Hey,